Today we're very excited to hear from Dr. Angelina Ross, her presentation on bat monitoring and conservation efforts here in the North Country. As we can all appreciate, bats are quite a unique animal. I think we all have a bat story to tell from one point of our lives, at least one. Bats are iconic in our popular culture as well, and we can all agree that they're fascinating creatures, and that's why we're here today. IRLC supporting bat conservation with over 2,500 acres of land preserved. The forests that we're protecting today will continue to mature in the old growth forests of a couple hundred years from now. And as these forests age, the shelter and habitat that they provide bats in tree holes, crevices, and under the bark will continue to improve. We actually have 3 bat boxes that this spring are protectors of water and habitat on the Indian River Lakes. That's our high school program. Those students will be researching bat habitat and developing recommendations for the placement of these bat boxes on our Grand Lake Reserve. And of course, the kids will be out actually helping us in place them. So I look forward to hearing Angelina's experiences and recommendations for the bat box placement during her presentation. So we're so lucky to have Dr. Angelina Ross join us today as a guest speaker. She graduated with a BA in biology and geology from SUNY Potsdam in 2002. She went on to earn a master's degree in conservation biology, studying spruce grouse habitat associations in 2008 from SUNY ESF. She took a job at DEC in 2006 as a biodiversity biologist, working on threatened and endangered species, focusing on projects related to the conservation of spruce grouse, Blanding's turtles, woods turtles, spotted turtles, short-eared owls, and chorus frogs. She earned her PhD at Clarkson University in 2018 in interdisciplinary bioscience and biotechnology. Her PhD research focused on modeling population viability of spruce grouse, experimental habitat management, and translocations of spruce grouse populations into New York from outside populations. She's been the DEC Region 6 bat coordinator since 2006 and conducts hibernacular surveys and acoustic monitoring surveys of migratory bats. She resides in Norfolk, New York, and enjoys skiing, running, cycling, hiking, and ice fishing. Angelina, thank you for joining us. So welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. The ice fishing stuff is new, so I'm not an expert by any means. And it's funny hearing you, even though I, sent you that bio, Wiley, it's weird to hear some of those dates seem like so long ago now. Then I've been at DEC for 14 years and I can't believe it. So anyway, yeah, so without further ado, I think I know how to do this. Oh, I can't share my screen yet. It's disabled. I think maybe somebody has to enable me to.
Yeah, give you hosting privileges.
Okay. All right. So I'm very excited to be talking about bats with everyone today. I've been working on bats since '06, but only marginally, really. There are experts in the state that I do work with who know a lot more about bats than I do. But I will do my best to answer any questions. And if there's something that, is asked that I don't have the answer to, I can get back to you also. I'm still, Wiley, I still don't have it, just so you know.
Heidi, can you, I'm not seeing it here. Hold on. I'm working on it. I see it.
Okay.
All right, here you go. You're good.
All right, let's see. Oh, yay. Okay.
Right.
All right, so I'll share, I think, this. And
it's coming.
I have good internet, but I have a very poor computer. This laptop is 10 years old. And I'm promised a new computer this month, but February is rapidly disappearing. So that remains to be seen. Whoops. I'm trying to move our faces off the side so I can see what's going on here. Okay. So, wonderful. Yeah, I wonder, is there a way to make this bar go away on top? I can't really read everything. Huh, it wasn't there yesterday, or when did we do our practice run yesterday? It wasn't there. Now it is. Okay, I'll just roll with it. Okay, so yeah, I wanted to give a little shout out to Carl Herzog from DEC. He's our real bat expert. He's our bat coordinator across the state, and Robin Niver as well from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. These two folks are real bat experts. They do bat work every day. I feel like more of an imposter sometimes, but I'll do my best here. So before we, get into all the New York aspects of our bat stuff, I wanna, okay, that's not going. I'm sorry. This bar, I would just like it to go away so I can see my slides. Just do that. Okay, it's not going away. Okay, so we'll start with just a little bit of background about bats, what we know about bats in general. I feel like this is kind of timely with COVID-19. Bats were blamed for the disease, and really it's people, right? Because there are so many of us, and we're destroying habitats and getting into close contact with other animals like bats that harbor a lot of these diseases like Ebola and SARS-CoV-2. And so so that, in light of COVID and all of this, I feel like talking about bats and learning about their importance in our ecosystems in the world, and how they actually impact humans in a very positive way, this is really timely. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we can get into more New York bat issues like white nose syndrome, results of our acoustic monitoring, and our hibernacula surveys. And we'll talk about threats and some management that we are conducting as well. And then we'll wrap up with what we can do as humans to help bats in our own neighborhoods. So. I may have a frozen computer. Are the slides changing for anybody else? No, okay. All right, bear with me. My apologies. This is only the second time I've done a talk this way. The first time it was smooth.
Angie, if you're having an issue, you might try closing PowerPoint and then just reopening PowerPoint.
Okay. I actually can't do anything right now.
In the meantime, if anyone, I have a game, kind of. So while she's doing that, if you know any interesting facts about bats, use your chat box and tell us what those are. And then maybe Angie can confirm or deny if that's a true fact or not. I'm gonna pull my chat box open here.
Okay. Does everybody see the slide that says common misconceptions? Hopefully.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So I guess I just can't use the enter button. And there's a thing telling me to move something. I'll ignore that. Okay. So some common misconceptions about bats I wanted to highlight, because some of them are kind of weird, I think. And this is something I've heard, and I've heard all of these before. Bats are flying mice. Well, this isn't actually true at all. Bats are not really related to mice as much as we would think. Bats are not rodents. They don't have multiple litters of babies each year like mice do. Bats will give birth to 1, maybe 2 pups each year. And they're actually bats are more related to pangolins and whales than they are to mice. And some bats are very long-lived. In fact, I saw a recent article that there was a bat, a Siberian bat, it was called the Brant's myotis, that was banded in 1964, and it was found alive and well 41 years later. And it was measured and let go, and nobody's seen it since, but 41 years is a long time for a little tiny animal like that. This is one I've heard repeatedly, and I feel like I even heard it this summer. Somebody saw a bat and said, oh my God, cover your head, you know, they're trying to get in your hair. This is also false. There's no real benefit for a bat to become entangled in your hair. I don't know why that would, how that ever started. Maybe it happened once by accident. I don't know, but bats are curious, but unlikely to get stuck in your hair.
Well, Wiley's safe now.
What's that?
I said Wiley's safe now.
Yeah. Another misconception, I don't really know if this is something that people say, I've never heard this one, that all bats are vampires, and vampire, you know, Hollywood comes into our lives, and these vampires turn into bats and fly out the window, you know, but of course they're not vampires. But there are 3 species of vampire bats, and I'm pretty much obsessed with vampire bats. So I just want to take a quick aside and talk about the common vampire bat a little bit. So the common vampire bat feeds on mammals, and the hairy-legged vampire bat and the white-winged vampire bat specialize on birds. And these are all bats of the New World. So we're talking about the Americas, and they occur in South and Central America. And the common vampire bat, just to highlight one of these, it consumes up to 60% of its body weight in blood each night. It feeds within 30 minutes. And as you might imagine, a blood meal has quite a bit of water in it. So they start urinating before they're done feeding on their host. And yeah, so that's not too fun, I'm sure. But so after initiating feeding, they're urinating to expel some of that water. And what's super interesting is they have a well-developed portion of their brain that is fine-tuned to key into the regular breathing patterns of sleeping mammals. So they're very good at finding sleeping mammals. And that's because, you know, a sleeping mammal doesn't notice when a bat walks up onto them. They actually land on the ground and use all 4 limbs to climb up onto their host instead of flapping down and landing on them and waking them up. So they can actually run and jump, and they're pretty awesome. They also have highly complex social interactions and form strong bonds with other bats. They beg for food, which is, again, blood. Regurgitated blood in your mouth doesn't sound that exciting to me, but to bats, you know, that eat blood, I guess it is. They share food among themselves, and they even assess each other's need for food. So they'll look at each other's abdomens, you know, check out this beggar. Does he really need my blood that I've worked so hard to get? And if they think that the other bat is cheating and is just saying they want to have, you know, they need blood and they're starving, you know, they'll deny the blood meal. They also groom each other, and they don't have to be related to share blood, because that has the meal that night, maybe the next night they won't have the meal, and they'll need to, you know, that behavior is reciprocated. So they rely on each other pretty closely, which is really neat. They also can run pretty fast, actually. In 1 second, they can cover over 2 meters of distance, which is very fast. They have powerful forelimbs that they use to propel themselves, and they can run. And they can also jump up and fly. So that, and I think probably most of us have seen bats flopping around on the ground. These are not the bats that do that. These, you know, hop around and walk around like spiders, and they're pretty awesome. This was really interesting. I was digging around online, and I found this article from October of last year, and they found that vampire bats actually socially distance when they feel sick. So they captured about 40 vampire bats, and they put radio transmitters on all of them. And half of the bats got an injection of salt water, and the other half got an injection of a lipopolysaccharide, which made them feel like they had the flu for 2 hours, and they tracked their movements, and the bats that got the salt water behaved normally, went to the colony, did the grooming, feeding, whatever. And the other bats that felt ill isolated away from the colonies and hung out until they felt better and then rejoined the colonies. That's super interesting. If bats can socially distance, I feel like we can too, right?
Do they wear bat masks?
I don't think so, but they did socially distance, which is pretty awesome, I think. So, but yeah, little bat masks would be cute. Although those little bat faces, I wouldn't want to cover those up because they're just so handsome, you know? They are a leaf nose, they're a type of leaf nose bat. And if you look at that nose, I guess you can see why they're called leaf nose bats. Another misconception is that all bats are rabid, and this is actually false as well. Bats submitted to the New York State, this is a snapshot of 2015, of about 3,000 bats submitted to the Department of Health in New York specifically, 3% of those were rabid. And I've seen figures across the country, it's generally about 6%. But that doesn't mean that we should assume that bats aren't rabid. If we have a bat in our house, or there's presumed contact, you have one in your bedroom when you wake up, definitely call the county health department and talk through their questions with them, because you may actually need a post-exposure rabies shot, which I hear is not that fun, but it's less unfun than it used to be. I guess it was a lot worse years ago. Bats are the only true flying mammals, and this is regarding powered flight, and this is actually true. While dolphins and humans can put on suits and flying squirrels can glide, powered flight is reserved only for bats. They are the only flying mammal. So they are special for that reason as well. Bats are blind. This is another misconception. This is false as well. They actually have excellent eyesight. In fact, there are two groups of bats. Generally, we think of the megabats, which are the old world species of flying foxes, fruit bats, and then the microbats, some occurring in the old world, but mostly, you know, this is what we see only actually in the new world are the microbats, the smaller bats. Some of them hunt by sight, like the pallid bat in the desert Southwest, eats grasshoppers and moths and sees them with its eyes. But the microbats also have echolocation. And, you know, that makes sense, you know, to develop echolocation when you're flying around at night looking for tiny insects, and also flying around in caves. So that is special. And actually humans, I saw a presentation, or it was actually a special on TV of blind humans using clickers and learning echolocation. So I guess we can do it to some degree. We can learn how to do that. They are primarily nocturnal. And so I mentioned the megabats and the microbats. So this is a yellow box, although on my computer it doesn't really look that yellow. Anyway, these are the megabats and these are the microbats. And the echolocation is pretty much reserved, you know, it's seen in the microbats. But there is a species of, the Egyptian fruit bat also uses echolocation, and it lives in caves, dark caves. So it makes sense for them to also use echolocation. I wanted to point out too that Rhinophilus, this genus, is a genus of about 106 species, and they are reservoirs for viruses such as Ebola, MARV, SARS-CoV-2, and yet they don't get ill from these diseases. They just are reservoirs for them. And so there may be something to be learned from these bats, why they don't get sick. They don't have the same types of immune responses that humans do that sometimes cause our demise when we get these diseases. So yeah, they are reservoirs, and they, you know, we could learn maybe something from them. So I mentioned reproduction a little bit. They have one young generally per year, sometimes twins. In New York State, they give birth during June and July, and in the fall we can see swarms when they're mating, and they're building up fat reserves. to go into caves or to migrate. We have 6 species of cave-dwelling bats in New York and 3 species of migratory bats, or tree bats, we call them. And you might see why they're called pups. This little one looks a little bit like a newborn puppy. They're super cute if you get the opportunity to see a bat up close. Their faces do kind of look like dogs. They are the second most speciose group of mammals in the world. 1 in 5 or 1 in 4, depending on which resource you look at, of all the species is a bat, of mammals specifically. The most speciose group is the rodents. 2 of 5 species of mammals in the world is a rodent. I didn't mean to make that face. Rodents are cool too. But anyway, bats 1 in 5. They're a pretty diverse group. They're found everywhere except the most extreme desert and polar regions. And they're in the family Chiroptera, which chiro, hand, ptera, wing, which is actually translated as hand wing. And those wings are actually their hands. They are very long-lived. As I mentioned, that Brandt's myotis has, that one individual that lived 41 years. So as we know, bats are primary predators of insects. They save $3.7 billion annually in agricultural pest control. They save us that. That's, no small amount. They also are responsible for rainforest seed dispersal. I saw a study that looked at did a bunch of plots of 1 square meter areas of rainforest, and they found anywhere between 2 and 80 seeds that were bat dispersed in that soil. So they're very important in dispersing rainforest species. And also they are pollinators. They're responsible for us having bananas and avocados and tequila. This is a very special species here. This is a lesser long-nosed bat. And it's special to me because I like tequila, and they pollinate agave plants. And, tequila is made from agaves. And I also, in 2001, I worked in Arizona. I was an intern with the Arizona Game and Fish Department. And part of our duties were to put camera traps up. This used to be a federally threatened species of bat, and we didn't know much about how to find these bats. So we put camera traps up on agave plants, and we also put camera traps up on bird feeders, on hummingbird feeders. These bats have tongues that are as long as their bodies. They're about 3 inches long, and they visit hummingbird feeders. And reliably, we did not find these bats going to the agave plants that were flowering that we selected for camera traps. Instead, when we had long-term bird feeders that were up consistently for a long time, we did have reliable visitation by lesser long-nosed bats to those bird feeders. Since then, the bat has come off the list, and they're now working on a 5-year study to kind of reevaluate and see how they're doing post delisting of the species. So they're off the threatened species list now. But they're kind of special to me because they were the first bat that I ever misnetted and that kind of thing. So anyway, guano is a high quality fertilizer used in gardens, and bats are also responsible for eating insects and things that are outside of caves, going into caves and defecating and bringing those nutrients and energy from outside of caves into caves. And there are other things that live in these caves that benefit from that. And back to some more sneaky benefits to human health that we might not be thinking about or that aren't very obvious. Bats are host to RNA viruses like Marburg, Ebola, that COVID-19. And yet they have low inflammatory responses to such diseases. So researchers are looking at why this is, and with the hopes of applying this knowledge to human health and to benefit humans. And then back to the happy vampire bat. So what I didn't mention about vampire bats is they don't drink blood like a Hollywood vampire does. They don't suck it out of fangs. but they have very sharp teeth to cut the skin or pelt of an animal. And then they have a very powerful anticoagulant in their saliva, which is nicknamed Draculin. And then they lap the blood as it oozes out. So this Draculin, being such a powerful anticoagulant, is being studied as medication to treat stroke patients. So that is something that is very beneficial to humans as well. So in the US, we have about 45 species of bats, and the desert Southwest is really the hotspot of diversity of bats. In New York, I mentioned we have 9 species, and all of them unique in some way. Some are pretty large, the hoary bat, silver-haired, those are pretty good sized bats, and then some more smaller little bats that are in caves. So we have 6 species of cave hibernating bats and 3 tree bats or migratory bats. And where we might find bats at any one time, it could be in the bark of trees. This is a really great tree. This is one of Robin's slides. I don't know if this is maternity roost, but this is a shagbark hickory where you can see bats' little tiny bodies might be anywhere in this bark. So this is probably a very important tree, depending on where it's located for day roosting bats. It could be in rock piles. People have found them in rock piles or in leaf litter as well. It could be in wetlands, along roads, even in those large trees, those decadent large trees in your backyard as well. Or they could be under the eaves or in your attic, in your barn, and mostly those bats are little brown and big brown bats. Excuse me. So now this bar is getting annoying. Okay, so they also, as I mentioned, the 6 species that overwinter in caves and mines. This is a mine in eastern northern New York in DEC region 5. I think it's a graphite mine. I've never visited this, but on my own or with work or anything. So I hear though that it's kind of scary. There are 300-foot elevator shafts that if you're not paying attention, you can just drop down into those. I wanted to highlight the Indiana bat, which is federally endangered species. And every other year in New York State, we do a census, and they lend themselves fairly well to being censused because they form tight clusters in these caves, and they only have a few known locations where they overwinter, one being this large mine. And then in my DEC region, which includes Jefferson County, St. Lawrence County, Oneida, Lewis and Herkimer counties, we only have one location near Watertown where we know of Indiana bats roosting or hibernating in the winter. So they hibernate in the winter, the cave bats. They build stores of body fat in the late summer and early autumn, and they reduce their temperatures and enter a torpor, which it may be a familiar term. It's also what hummingbirds do at night. They lower their body temperatures and become sort of inactive and lower their metabolism to make it through the night, because hummingbirds are very high energy and require a lot of food. And so these bats can overwinter, not eat for 3 to 4 months, or more, 5 months, as they remain underground in these caves. They do wake up periodically, and then shortly after that go back to sleep. Some potential threats to bats include, and this isn't just specific to bats, habitat loss and fragmentation is a huge stressor for most species declines. It causes species declines of many species. So bats don't like to fly across huge open areas without resting spots, or, you can imagine an owl could pick off a bat if it was flying across an open field. So they tend to not really do that so much. So if you have a lot of fragmentation of habitat, that's not good for bats either. Disturbance and vandalism, especially during the winter, is also not not ideal for Indiana bats in particular and other cave-dwelling bats, because your presence in the caves arouses them and they fly around and use some of those energy stores that are so vital for them to get through the winter to make it to spring when the bugs are flying around and they can eat again. Collisions with wind turbines, this is something relatively new. In the past 15 years, we've seen bats almost being attracted to the vortices at the tips of those blades. You know, they do post-construction monitoring. That's what these people are doing up here, walking the fields, looking for bats. And some of the tree bats are the most affected by these turbines. And there was a study in the early, I think it was 2007 or 2010 or 2007, around that time. They reduced what they call the cut-in speeds of the turbine blades. So any speeds, any wind speeds, I think it was less than 7 miles per hour, the turbines wouldn't spin. So once it was over 7 miles an hour, they functioned normally. And the bats tended to migrate on nights when there wasn't severe winds. So anything below the 7 mile per hour wind speeds was when most of the bats were out hibernating, and it reduced mortality by a significant amount. And it didn't really reduce wind power generation that much. So that is being explored in different wind power projects as well. Most of the bats that get struck by turbine blades are hoary bats, and then eastern red bats and silverhead. So I mentioned those migratory species, with other species as well. And then white nose syndrome has caused the death of millions of bats, unfortunately. And so what is that? I'm sure most of us have heard of this. It's a fungal disease affecting the hibernating bats, and it's responsible for unprecedented mortalities. It was first recognized in New York State in a cave near Albany in the winter of 2006-2007, and it has spread rapidly across the states and some Canadian provinces as well. And there's evidence, it's really pointing to humans, again, probably brought this disease or this fungus into our caves from Europe and Asia. There's pretty good evidence of that. So it's a fungus called Pseudogymnascus destructans. We'll just call it PD when we refer to it, because nobody wants to say that again. The fungus thrives in low temperatures and high humidity levels, which are consistent with our caves in pretty much the states. So just for effect here, I wanted to show this graphic, which shows how rapidly this disease, this syndrome, has spread across North America. So we had
Angie, I'm going to interrupt you just for a second. I think we're still seeing the slide with the bats in the cave.
Oh, really? Okay. Bats in the cave.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe just like minimize it and open it again and see if it will refresh itself.
And show. There's the bats in the cave from
caves, mines, and winter for 6 New York species.
I'm sorry, I talked fast and a lot. So was it this?
We're still stuck. So here, try unsharing and then sharing again. So if you go to the top and hit stop share, and then
it was slide. Looks like. Oh, never mind.
Which one?
The one with the mines.
Yeah. So the one with the turbine we didn't see. Yeah.
Oh,
right?
okay.
Wait. Oh no, we didn't see the one before that either.
Okay, so you're seeing this one now, hopefully.
Yeah, we can see now. It just got stuck. So if you want to show us the pictures of the, like we didn't see any pictures of the white nose.
Oh,
yeah, we saw that one.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. It was interesting what you were saying, so we're still listening.
Okay, so you do see this, right?
We can see it now. Go forward and see if we can see that. There we go. Yeah,
okay.
if you just want to show us the photos and then.
I'm so sorry. Okay, so here's a nice clustering bats. over here. And then I was talking about wow, that was a while ago. Okay, so potential threats, and I just have some development here. And then, yeah, so some of our entrances to our caves look pretty rough with vandalism and graffiti. And you can find beer bottles and different things inside the caves, unfortunately. So I mean, these photos are really just for effect, just so you weren't looking at my face yammering, but now that is actually what happened. So everybody sees you can see that, the change there.
They can see it now.
Pie chart. Okay. So yeah, roughly half of the species involved in North American collisions with wind turbines are hoary bats. Those are the big ones. So yeah, most of them are these tree bats, more than 75%, well more than 75%. So white nose syndrome, you can see it on these bats here on their noses, and it's very visible. Even though it's a microscopic, fungus, it proliferates and then it's all over the bats, and it looks almost frosty, like a frosty. So as I mentioned, in 2006 and 2007 in the cave near Albany is where we initially found white nose syndrome. And so this is that graphic I wanted you all to see, just how rapidly this has moved across North America. So this is the next year. It's moving into the east, northeast, and then boom, now it's down in Virginia. And it's just rapidly, year to year. The red are the new infections of that year. So 2012, 2013, 2014, and so on. Now it's in Washington in 2016. How to get there? Probably wasn't a bat that flew over there. Probably a human being. Sorry to be so disappointed in humans lately, but this is just hard to look at. So symptoms, actually, let me just hold off and let's just absorb this for a second, because now it's in California, Washington, South Dakota, and Wyoming, and just not okay. And it's likely to spread even more, as time goes on here. Also, in this past winter, we didn't do any monitoring of bats. The Fish and Wildlife Service smartly put a moratorium on any bat work and bat handling this year, because humans could be infected with COVID, and we didn't want to give the bats COVID, which would then in turn probably affect humans more in the future as we work with them again. So anyway, so some symptoms of white nose syndrome. I mentioned that frosted look of the bats. You can see it kind of looks a little bit like a frosted look. It causes these lesions and it replaces their tissue with fungus tissue, which does regenerate if they clear the infection, which does happen if they survive the winter. They can clear the infections in the summer. But they only weigh like 2 dimes. They're only this big under all that fur and skin of those wings. They're tiny creatures. So, they have to be in pretty good health when they go into hibernation to make it out. And I remember years ago when white nose was brand new, and I went outside in the snow, and I think I was at Whetstone Gulf. We had a call that bats were flying around in the snow, and that is not a good sign. They're desperate, looking for food, they're starving, and there is not any invertebrates flying around when it's minus 10 degrees outside. So it's very sad to see. So I wanted to go through briefly this timeline of what we knew then and how we've progressed in our knowledge of white nose, because it's pretty interesting. So I mentioned it was PD, and we initially thought it was Geomyces destructans, and that occurs in our caves as well in the States, but PD does not. So we didn't really know what was going on. In 2009, they isolated it and they thought it was Geomyces destructans, and they tested transmission, and it did move from the environment to bats. The primary mode of transmission is from bat to bat. You saw those clusters of bats, but it can move from the environment to the bats. So there's strong evidence by 2010 that it is the cause of white nose syndrome. And what it does is erode the living skin and it replaces the skin with its own gross fungal cells. But we yet, at that point, didn't know what was the actual cause of death of these animals. Was it the fungus or was it related to the fungus and some other reason? So by 2012, we started to notice, we had sensors in these caves, and we started to notice there was frequent waking of these bats and severity of infection. You know, if they were more infected, they tended to have more morbidity and mortality. And they also inoculated some bats to test this hypothesis that this fungus was not from the US. And so that was 2012's picture, and it supported this novel pathogen hypothesis. So the bats didn't evolve with this fungus. So in 2013, there was some genetic work done, and Pseudogymnascus destructans was what the fungus was actually known to be at that point. So it was this novel pathogen from Europe and Asia, and there was no close relatives in North America of this fungus. So it supports this hypothesis even further that it's a non-native invasive fungus that is in our caves. It was probably brought by humans. And to make matters worse, this fungus thrives in these conditions that are in our caves, these wet, cool conditions. So we think it probably will always be there, and it will persist, maybe even indefinitely. So our bats will potentially clear the infections, the bats that survive, that have enough energy stores so they wake up and they groom themselves, and then they go back, you know, into hibernation or into torpor. And they do that several times in the winter, and that eats up their energy stores as they're doing that. And so unfortunately, most of the bats don't make it, but the ones that survive, you know, may clear the infections, or usually clear the infections in the summer and then go back into the caves and get re-inoculated from the cave environment. Unfortunately, you can see on this is actually one of our people doing, trying to avoid knocking bats off the wall as we count the Indiana bats. And you can see that all the soil and dirt on the coveralls there. It's impossible to stay clean. So you can see if you're a caver, you can imagine that you'd be spreading this stuff around from cave to cave. In 2015, it was found in China, but there was no obvious signs of population collapses of their bats. And as I mentioned, there's that seasonal variation in infection rates. So they get infected in the fall as they go into the caves, and the worst infections are in mid-winter, and that's when the most mortality is caused. I just want to mention a little bit about how we do our hibernacula surveys, because it's pretty interesting. We're focused on the federally endangered Indiana bat for these, but we also count all the bats that we encounter in these caves. So we do these every other year and get an index of the numbers of Indiana bats and other bats that we encounter. And it can be difficult to do this. So we take high quality photographs of the bats. We don't light up the place and hang around in there. We go in with a laser pointer. They always pretty much nest. They hibernate in the same locations. So we find them and we use a laser pointer to focus our cameras in the dark, use a high quality SLR camera, and then take these photos. And afterwards, you know, we get out of there, and afterwards, when we're sitting at our desks again, we count noses, and we put, this is kind of a goofy example, but because it's such a small cluster, you can see there are 10 bats there. But some of these clusters are rather large, and so this is probably 2,500 bats on a wall here. This is, I'm guessing it's pre-white nose syndrome. And so you can imagine, you know, having a grand old time trying to count all the noses without this simplified putting dots on the noses thing that we do. So that helps us there. But unfortunately, white nose has caused a 78% reduction in Indiana bats. And it's even worse for tricolors, northern long-eareds, and little browns. I mean, northern long-eareds have declined over 99% since the onset of white nose, which is awful. And just looking at some data of little brown bats, even, you know, since white nose was first found in that one cave, and it took a year or two for all the caves to be infected. But by 2010, we had an order of magnitude fewer bats on these hibernation counts, unfortunately. So they're not in a good way. So then we mounted an effort in 2009 to index to make a population index of our tree bats or our migratory bats. And we knew we wouldn't be able to count or get a rough estimate of population sizes, but we thought if we had a before and after picture, use the same methods to survey these animals, we would have an idea of whether or not they're increasing or decreasing. And so we did this using acoustic transect surveys. These are super fun surveys to do. So these are random locations, and it's sort of in a grid across New York. And they are not on major highways, and there's a very important reason for that. We have to drive 20 miles per hour for the entire transect, and it is very difficult to drive 20 miles per hour steady. So, and it's very difficult when there are a lot of traffic and cars on the road as well. So we put our recording devices on the roof of our car, and we drive these 20-mile transects. And the next time we do, this is in June and early July, so we'll do it one direction, and then the next time we do it the other direction. So we do 2 replicates per year. The detectors are pointed straight up, and the program, so we have a laptop in the car and a GPS on the roof as well, and the program gives us feedback when we hear the bats. When it hears a bat, it kind of mixes the sound to a lower frequency so we can hear it. And it's very exciting when you hear the chirps of a bat when you're driving. And the 20 mile per hour speed is so that we don't double count bats. No bats can fly over 20 miles per hour, at least our bats can't. So what this shed light on is that those tree bats were not declining. There's no evidence, we have no evidence of that over the 10 years of our surveys. However, the total percent of the myotis detections, so the cave bats, those have declined. And this is probably from white nose syndrome. Makes sense. So we're seeing that even on our summer detections, that decline. So what can we do? Well, we put our heads together, and they've studied treating caves, and treating individual bats rather. I don't know that any studies of treating caves with antifungal have taken place, but they've treated bats and they get reinfected. So, I mean, our hands are really tied. We don't really have a lot of options to head off white nose syndrome at this point, other than to keep people out of caves. So that's one of our management efforts that we started in 2006, just gating caves so that bats can emerge. And there is some method to the distances in these bars and that kind of thing, because you don't want this to appear as a barrier to bats. So bats can fly freely through these gates, but people can't get through. And who knows what other kind of diseases may come, so we keep people out of the caves as much as we can. And this is something that's not that exciting, but I do pretty much every day at my job. I review projects, development projects such as solar power, wind power, and any other kind of development that goes into our permits office. And this is just what that looks like. It's not very exciting, but this is hypothetical as well. But these are, they could be bats, they could be other endangered species. But for example, if this is a solar project and this is a bat, we call it a hit, it's near a bat known location, we can offer actually requirements of these developers to avoid forested areas when they put their solar panels up and just minimize impacts to the species in this way as well. It's a little more reactive and less proactive, but it is something that we can do, and we do every single day. So what can others do as well to help bats? Avoid killing or injuring bats. One way is to remove suitable roost trees only during the winter time when bats are either migrated out of the area or hibernating underground. So if you have a hazard tree, you have to take it down, But if you can avoid certain times of year, that's ideal. You can work with trained, licensed nuisance wildlife control operators. We license them through DEC. Some of them are very good at removing bats from your home. They know the time of year when pups are done. They're weaned and they're flying after August 15th. You can put one-way gates in tiny spaces. It's never a good idea to use spray foam insulation. There have been instances when bats have been entombed in that spray foam. So those expanding foam things, methods aren't always ideal. But yeah, nuisance wildlife control operators are very knowledgeable about that. And bats have an uncanny way of getting stuck in sticky traps. So those are not ideal. You don't want to have bats stuck to traps and just dehydrate and die, while they're entangled in these things. Maintain suitable roosting and foraging habitat and clean drinking water sources. If you have a bird bath outside, keep it clean, make sure the water is clean. They do drink while on the wing. And minimize widespread use of pesticides, insecticides. Learn more about bats and white nose syndrome. You can teach and talk to others about bats and their benefits to humans. Support nature centers, like everybody here probably does. You can also put up bat houses, and these work best if you have a bat in a structure and you are planning on evicting them. If you put a bat house up first, they may start using the bat house, and then it may make it easier to evict bats if they have another place to go to. And so I have a website next, but I just want to talk a little bit bat house construction. I'm pretty much done. If anybody's looking at their watch. So they have to be bigger than 2 feet tall. The chambers, the partitions in there, you want about 3/4 of an inch to 1 inch apart. And you can see these bats are packed right into this. The rough cut lumber is best to use because bats need to grab onto something. You have to stain it black in New York. You want these to be black. They have to be put in south-facing areas with at least 6 to 8 hours of sun exposure. You need to use stain, for example, instead of paint, because you don't want to fill in those rough spaces with paint. They have to be actually it's best to put them on the side of a building under eaves where they're protected from the weather a little bit, or on a pole. Never want to put them on a tree because raccoons and other predators can climb those trees and just reach their little hands up in there and pick bats out and just chew on them. So you don't want to attract them to an area where they're actually going to be harmed. And then, they drop right out. The bottom part of that has to be relatively open so the bats can drop out and fly. And about 25 feet away from them, you don't want to have, within that radius, you don't want to have any branches or anything in the way. And for all of that information in a very concise format, Bat Conservation and Management has very, very good information on bat boxes. It's a wonderful resource. And they also have pre-made bat boxes that you can buy, or they're not made, but they're kits that you can put together. And some of them are really attractive bat boxes. So that's a very good website, as is Bat Conservation International. They have curriculum guides and lots of tons of info on bats and how you can get involved in bat conservation. whitenose-syndrome.org as well, and then the DEC as well has some information if you're thirsty for more information. And so just to remind everyone, be careful if you see a bat on the ground or in your house, and you think there may be contact, make sure you call the county health department and talk it over with them. But if you have to remove the bat, use gloves, or you can use a coffee can and gloves and kind of shoo them in and bring them outside. If your pet comes into contact with a bat, definitely contact your veterinarian because they may need a booster shot, and always the county health department to run through that stuff, that information. And so this is my contact information if anybody wants to contact me. And I don't have a Twitter account, but apparently DEC does. They're ahead of me. This is kind of crazy to think of, and Flickr, but I've never visited those sites. But if you'd like to, those are the addresses. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer them. And I see there's 11 things in the chat. Hopefully the slides are advancing for everyone. Let's see. Should I put?
Thank you.
Thanks. Does anybody want to see those websites again? I can also provide anything.
I mean, could you make
Yeah,
this?
I can share them.
Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, could you make the slides available and then we could look at those things at our leisure?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I can email the slides out to everybody after the presentation. And this presentation will be uploaded onto our YouTube page as well. So you can also subscribe on YouTube, and then it'll give you a notification every time we upload a new video if anybody's interested in that as well.
Nice.
So if anyone has any questions, we can, Angie, you can unshare if you want your screen. And if anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself and ask, or you can put them in the chat box. We did have one question about the white nose, but and what's being done about that, but you kind of covered that afterwards. Does anyone have any questions?
I see.
Angela, I have a question, two questions on the feeding habits of the vampire bat and also the ones who would eat insects. First one on the insects, have they been known to eat any of the emerald ash borers?
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't seen anything on that, but I would think that, I mean, it would depend on, I don't know much about the life history of the emerald ash borer. I think they're pretty much, so they're under the bark, right, until they hatch, or I'm sorry, metamorphose, and then they fly around. I would think anything flying around, if it's small enough to get into a bat mouth, they wouldn't be picky. But I don't know that there is any documented emerald ash borer eating, by bats. So I don't know.
I was just wondering whether the DEC was possibly exploring that to help, combat the emerald ash borer explosion. My second one on the feeding habits of the vampire bats, can they differentiate between a healthy host and a sick host? And have they ever fed to the point of killing the host?
That's an awesome question that I also don't know the answer to. I don't know. I know that, I've seen videos and I've heard tale of multiple bats feeding on the same cow, and I think for smaller animals, I think that may have been, so there's a really cool video on YouTube that I meant to put a link to, but honestly, I had so many slides, I didn't think we'd have time to watch it. It's a vampire bat eating or taking blood from a Humboldt penguin. Actually, there's a colony, and they had little baby penguins there, and the bats are all kind of, going around. And it alluded in the video, it kind of alluded to the fact that these these young penguins can't really sustain a lot of bites from these bats, yet another threat for these Humboldt penguins. And it kind of painted a little bit of the vampire bats in kind of a bad light, but I mean, it was really cool to see. It was the only documented feeding on Humboldt penguins. But I can imagine if there's a host that's small enough that if enough bats, I mean, that anticoagulant is so powerful, they keep bleeding even after the bats leave. So it's possible. But some of them, they just eat, cattle or chewing on cattle at night, and those things are huge, But they do also transmit diseases. They can transmit rabies. So it is a concern to cattle ranchers, in South America as well. And some of them mounted that, these culling operations, yeah. So I don't really know where that's at right now, but educating people is important. So I didn't really answer your question, but I danced around a lot of stuff.
No, I appreciate it. My first experience with seeing a large colony of bats when I was in the Marine Corps over in Africa, and I opened up the door to the embassy to receive my food that was coming in, and the skies got eerily dark, and it was thousands and thousands of bats flying out that night to go feed.
That's cool. I've in Arizona, I've seen Mexican free-tailed bats emerge from under bridges. And it was a thing that we would do on our days off, because we couldn't get enough of bats. And the skies it was crazy, and they're like, hey, when you look up, make sure you keep your mouth shut. Something I had to be told, because, guano goes in your mouth, you don't want that. So yeah, there are quite a few, 10,000 or so emerging from a bridge, Very cool.
I have a question. The graphs you showed for some of the cave dwelling bats in New York were pretty grim, like down 80, high 80 into 99+%. And certainly anecdotally, we don't see bats the way we used to see them. I mean, it's very, very clear. You see a handful a summer. I see more maybe in the fall when maybe those are the migrating tree bats. I don't know. But anyway, my question is, I've heard a couple of things. So the quick question is it true that big brown bats have some resistance?
That's what I've heard. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I guess, it would be interesting to know how come, what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. And then also I've heard that, the curve was very abrupt and it seems to be leveling off and maybe even starting to very slowly. I didn't see that in your chart, but I've heard that maybe they're starting to plateau and very slowly increase because they've got a very slow reproductive output, right? So, is that because, so this is my question, is that because presumably the ones that seem to survive the fungus have something in their genetics that slowly over time may produce slightly more fit offspring and the population may bounce back? It won't be in our lifetimes. I mean, we're talking centuries at that pace.
Yeah, and that's an awesome question. And I'm guessing there is nobody who knows the answer to that.
Right.
Well, and it, over time we'll see, but I know that is a big question that we're all asking each other right now.
Right.
And as we pointed out, that low reproductive output is, it's rough for bats because they're not like mice and they're not going to just bounce back overnight. So it's going to take a long time. And I, like you, have definitely noticed
Sure.
decline in observations. It's just anecdotal, but yeah, it's scary.
Right.
So.
And people always ask, and I think there may be some truth to it. I mean, there's so many factors, it's hard to tease it out. But as this huge insectivorous group has essentially vanished in numbers. What are the impacts? I mean, you can talk about mosquitoes, but whatever. I mean, there's got to be huge ecosystem impacts, and I don't even know how you begin to study that.
Right. I know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
It's just super depressing,
Yeah.
I started in 06 and that's when it wasn't me. I didn't bring it here.
No.
But man, it was like a thing that we talked about every day at first. And we talk about it less now, but yeah, it has to have huge implications.
Yeah.
On a on a positive note, I have 30. I'm not sure what type. I think they're little brown bats in my garage.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So that was just counting one side of the garage. I don't know what the other side would have produced because I couldn't, I can't see that from where I was. But so I'm not sure how best to support those bats. They're coming in through the roof, apex of the roof ridge, and they've just got access at a few different spots. And it's fun to watch them come out at night. I live in a wooded lot, and I had one mosquito bite last year. So I would just say that they seem to be doing pretty well. I've had them up there for a couple of years now, and, but I do want to help them, any way I can. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, probably just doing nothing is the best way, because, if you messed with it in any way to try to make it better, you might mess it up, I mean, that's what I would do. I think it's really awesome, encouraging, whatever, that you're, most of the people I talk to at my job want the bats out of there, so, I mean, it's awesome that you are into that,
There's two sides to the story. My wife, Wiley, by the way, thank you for inviting me to this today. When I mentioned to her I was attending this, she was like, well, does anybody want to come and get our bats out, on the roof? And I was like, well, it's not going to happen as far as I know. So
you can put up some bat boxes. Maybe they'll choose to use those instead, and then that'll make her happy, or at least your efforts will make her happier, and then there'll be more room for them, maybe,
Sure. Sounds like a good plan. Thank you. And thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, sorry about those slides not moving. I didn't have the chat thing up, so I didn't notice all the comments that the slides are stuck. I do see a question about how many bats are dying from wind turbines, and I had a figure I didn't include for, I had 86 slides. So I saw that per megawatt, it's 7 bats on average per megawatt per year get killed by wind turbines. So some of our we're designing larger and larger wind turbines. So I don't know if that number will, increases or decreases based on size of these wind turbines. But on average, it's about 7 bats per megawatt per year. So whether or not that's a lot is tough to say.
We had a couple of other questions in the chat box about how the bat decline might be affecting other populations that eat insects. And then, what populations may be benefiting from the added insect load due to the lack of bat predation.
Right. Well, certainly anything that eats insects, insectivorous birds, might increase, because of that. But generally mosquitoes are out at night and bats capitalize on that, So it's tough to say, but, anything that might be taken advantage of, bats, or birds do eat insects as well. So that, frogs maybe, I don't know. I mean, it's tough to make such, linear conclusions like that is difficult. And ecosystems and food webs are so complex. It's tough to say. But.
And then there was another question about using guano and whether there's any, whether those viruses could be transmitted that way.
I would imagine, I don't know for sure, but I would not lick guano or touch it with your hands and then touch your mouth or eyes or anything. If you're going to handle this stuff, assume that that stuff is hot, so if you're going to handle it, you use gloves. Even don't stir up a lot of dust. If you have to sweep it up or something, definitely don't do that. Take care to if you have a bunch of it in your attic or something. And I think you might be able to have somebody like professionals clean it as well. So, I mean, I would imagine, just like humans, we can spread disease through our waste, so can bats. And, it's probably, who knows how some of these diseases jump from bats to humans, but affecting their habitats and putting humans and bats in closer contact with another. There are, there are people who go into caves and collect guano in different cultures and use it in their gardens and stuff. And maybe that's how some of these diseases get passed on. The mode of transmission of COVID-19 from the bats to people, and there is a civet that's an intermediate host. I looked into this a little bit, expecting it might come up today. And I only know enough to be dangerous, but the actual pathway of transmission has not been identified and maybe never will be identified. So we just have to be super careful with dealing with really any mammal, because these zoonotic diseases that jump across species boundaries, are out there, and some that we don't even know about yet. And we just have to be, careful handling guano as well. But as far as it being in the garden and then, affecting your food, that's not an issue. Just ingesting it in some way, getting it into your body directly is what we have to worry about.
Anybody else have any questions for Angie? Well, that was a great presentation. I can give you a minute to just maybe do like a final word, and then we'll say goodbye to everyone.
Yeah, I am super excited that you asked me to do this. Thank you. It forced me to get back my mind into bats, which was a good exercise. I mean, things were pretty busy lately, and I put off thinking about this presentation for a long time, until this past week, and then finally I was scrambling. But I'm really, I have a renewed love again for bats because of this here. So thank you for having me. I'm super happy to have the opportunity to talk to everybody. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was very informative and interesting too. So, and it was great to see everybody. Thanks for signing on today. Again, if you enjoyed the presentation, you can go to either Depauville's website or IRLC's website, or both, and make a donation. And we hope to see you all in our next presentation about environmentally friendly gardening. So have a great weekend.
Thank you, Angelina. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again.
Bye.